Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AIIA Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, wherever we may be, and pay respects to elders past and present. And very warm welcome to members of AIIA, other guests here, our Zoom audience, and members of the diplomatic corps joining us. So for the Zoom audience, we'll take questions towards the end. As usual, put them in the Q&A tab in the toolbar. We'll get through as many as we can. So to talk about, a very eventful week in British politics, continuity and change in British politics, it's a pleasure to welcome back Dr. Ben Wellings. Ben's senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Monash University. He's also the director of the Monash PPE, politics, philosophy and economics degree. His research focuses on nationalism in the UK and the European Union and international politics of the Anglosphere. He's written a couple of books recently, English Nationalism and Euroscepticism, and English Nationalism, Brexiting the Anglosphere. And Ben, it's great to have you back. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Alistair. Welcome, members. Thank you for inviting me back again, and welcome those joining us online via Zoom. So I think I was chatting with Alistair about doing something around the change of leadership in the Conservative Party back maybe in early August, I think it was. And we sort of thought, well, you know, probably something worth updating people, change of leader, give her a little bit of time to settle in. Don't want to go too soon with this one, you know, wait for something to happen. We might time it with the conference, the Conservative Party conference. They don't usually make much of a splash in Australia, but, you know, could be a good way of linking this in. And of course, it's been quite an extraordinary month in politics. I've got some prime ministerial quotes that I'll be coming out with, but you know what the first one is. Harold Wilson, a week is a long time in politics. And Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng have indeed proved that. I was talking on the radio this morning and, this afternoon, and you know, the presenter was saying, well, isn't it extraordinary that they've managed to kind of have this effect on the British economy within 4 weeks of taking office. And that, of course, is actually a generous timescale, because for 10 days there was a period of mourning, so there was no official business. So it's actually sort of more like 20 days. It's been very difficult to kind of keep on top of the topic, really. I think John asked me if I rewrote my speech, you know, earlier this morning. I said, well, just like the Chancellor, yes, I have. It really suits you know, of course, we're all focused on the change because of a significant government U-turn. But we need to keep in mind the continuity, not just in the analytical sense, but also claims about continuity that were made during the leadership election campaign that saw Liz Truss win. So I'm going to go over all of those. And I would notice that I was last here on the 15th of February when Boris Johnson had survived a vote of no confidence and a spill motion, because the Conservative MPs had rallied round the leader at that particular stage, which led me to speculate on the strange death of English conservatism, borrowing that that title about the strange death of liberal England from Dangerfield. So I think lots has happened. Has anything changed? This is sort of just a very simple analytical question. And we can get focused on the churn. So I did think that it would be worth pointing out that it was often mentioned that the Queen in her 70-year reign had 15 prime ministers, but we should note that 20% of those came in the last 3 years of her reign. So I was getting the sense we've had such a turnover of staff at the top of the Conservative Party that British politics is beginning to look like Italian politics looked during the Cold War. One party's in power, is just the leaders change, the personnel shifts and switches. Now, it's not the only time, of course, that the Queen had more than three prime ministers in quick succession. We might think of 2007 and 10, the shift between Blair, Brown and Cameron. We might also think of 1963 to 64. We had Macmillan, Alec Douglas-Hume and Wilson. But both of those changes involved changes of government, right? So there was a little bit of manoeuvring at the top, which is probably a sign of, not a good sign for a government in terms of its longevity. But the third party in that was always an incoming prime minister. So we don't have that now with the Conservative Party. So something, to my mind, is not right in the Kingdom of Denmark, if you don't mind me mixing my monarchical metaphors. And then there's this sort of strange sense of temporality, what's been happening to the sense of time in British politics. I remember during the parliamentary, the really intense parliamentary phases of Brexit in 2018 to 19, lots would happen, but nothing would change. And now we're getting into some sort of sense where change seems to be a means of management. I think Boris Johnson likes to sort of govern by crisis. I don't think, in an intentional way. And I think the Truss Kwarteng debut has been an unintentional chaos. So what I'm going to do over the next, additional half an hour from now, so totaling about 40 minutes, I want to talk about Boris Johnson's legacy. And then I want to talk about, the claims to continuity and how those turned out in terms of the leadership election contest. And I do want to then put something in about the monarchy, because of course we had the death of the Queen in that period, and now we have had Charles III become king. And I want to make the point that the funeral, the coronation is going to be quite different, done in quite a different political register, I imagine, to the funeral. Then I will just, make some final remarks about where this might all be heading, and perhaps we can speculate on some of these questions during the question, or some of these issues, I beg your pardon, during the question time. But the overall argument, what I want to say is, and I wrote this for the conversation back in early September, published when Liz Truss, it was announced here in Australia that Truss was going to be the next Prime Minister, that the Conservatives have just made it harder for themselves to win the next election. Now, when I wrote that in September, I thought I was sticking my neck out a bit. Things started to change, and especially now it seems like completely received wisdom. But we do need to think about the Borisonian legacy in that regard, because there is still a very sizable parliamentary majority, which it would be quite incredible if that was squandered in the space of one parliamentary term. Anyway, I shall now move on. So when Boris Johnson eventually succumbed to the pressure from partly from backbenchers, but mostly from his cabinet colleagues, and resigned over both the Partygate, the kind of hypocrisy that his behaviour during lockdowns, which where other people were obeying rules that his government had set, he was breaking them, and it all fitted into a sort of a picture of disdain for ordinary people, if you like, but also in parliamentary terms, some very defending some very ill-considered choices over people with anyway, some poor choices which were then defended in terms of appointments within Parliament. He stepped down. He gave in his final speech at the House of Commons in July his own verdict. Of course, leaders are always very keen about their legacy. And his legacy, the way he described it, was mission largely accomplished. Okay, so remember, he'd been, this is obviously a play on the George W. Bush thing, which was, of course, very hubristic. But Johnson said mission largely accomplished. And I think, what he's going to be remembered for is getting Brexit done. Okay, so of course, it's true that the 2019 election was quite a remarkable win, gave the Conservative Party a parliamentary majority, the likes of which they'd not seen since 1987, put them up in an incredibly comfortable position in which the Labour Party had basically given up the idea of getting back into power any time within the next 10 years, because notionally there's a 5-year parliamentary term. But I think one thing to remember here is, of course, that Johnson was solving a problem of his own making. He was absolutely instrumental in blocking Theresa May's proposal, stepping out of the cabinet, becoming a kind of a difficult voice from the backbenches, and gathering around him a group of hard Eurosceptic MPs, galvanizing that sense of frustration within and about Parliament. So within Parliament, he was able to gather more and more Eurosceptic MPs around his notion of hard Brexit. He was able to kind of channel a popular discontent with the political process at the time of the 2019 elections, making this as a people versus parliament election, because the referendum had set up that dynamic that most people voted to leave the EU, but Parliament couldn't find a way to do that. And he very effectively put himself up as a kind of a fixer, if you like. But I think it is important to note, as Meg Russell in the UK has made this point repeatedly, that he actually did play a very large part in creating the problem that brought down May's government, brought him in. Of course, the deal he did kicked the whole Northern Ireland process down the road, and squandered lots of political capital in terms of the UK's reputation for breaking promises and treaties it had made with other actors, for which one of the hard Conservatives the day before yesterday actually apologised for at the conference, perhaps belatedly. So I think reasons to question that part of the legacy. The next part is levelling up. Now, this is very much a domestic agenda, and it hasn't necessarily had the kind of same reach in terms of international coverage that Brexit did, which was, of course, a spectacular strategic reorientation of the United Kingdom. But the flip side of Brexit was levelling up. And that is because the Brexit vote revealed some quite sharp socio-economic divides within the United Kingdom, but particularly within England. And in particular, it's there is a very significant divide that's opened up between London and the rest of the UK and the rest of England. And this is nothing new, but it has been accelerated, of course, by London's shift to a financial centre and service economy, and the historic demise of manufacturing in northern parts of England. And politically, this played out because a lot of former Labour voters switched to the Conservatives in a group of seats that were known as the Red Wall, right? So these were traditionally, we say traditionally, for 2 decades or more, Labour voting seats, which had then, the 2019 election, ostensibly over frustration with Brexit, switched to Conservatives and delivered this majority. So there needed to be a response to this. And Theresa May had anticipated the kind of levelling up idea. She talked in her speech when she became Prime Minister of looking out for the left behind or the jams, the just about managings, right? So there was a sense that there were a lot of people like running to stand still in British society, right? So you'd be working hard, but your wages would be depreciating. You wouldn't be able to see the benefits which were, on display for that increasing that group of wealthy people whose wealth was increasing, particularly in the southeast of England and London. So this, of course, was a worthy endeavour, and it was presented in almost moral terms. I've got a couple of quotations from Johnson's speech, where he launched levelling up in July 2021. So you notice that the idea was there at the 2019 election, and it had a name, but it didn't have form. And it took a while. There was always this critique, well, it sounds good, but what is it? And Johnson, a little over a year ago, tried to put some flesh around that. But so here's what he said. It is the mission of this government to unite and level up across the whole UK, not just because that is morally right, but because if we fail, then we are simply squandering vast reserves of human capital. We are failing to allow people to fulfill their potential. We are holding our country back. So you can see a variety of reasons to do this. You can pitch that in, you can frame it in national terms, you can frame it in economic terms, you can frame it in moral terms. So it's speaking to quite a diverse audience. But here was an interesting thing that when I was reading this speech the other day that kind of jumped out of me, that Johnson had a sort of florid turn of phrase, didn't he? So this is a kind of a verbatim, presumably this was a speech that was written, but he's embellished it. And in terms of the present crisis that the Conservative Party is undergoing is very interesting. He said, an unspoken assumption by policymakers that investment should always follow success. So that, to use a football metaphor, a soccer metaphor, the approach has always been to hang around the goalmouth rather than being the playmaker. And this is the bit that jumped out at me. Or to borrow from the Bible, for biblical comparison, governments have created a sort of Matthew effect. To him that hath shall be given, right? So, and then he says, so you end up investing in areas where house prices are already sky high and where transport is already congested, and by turbocharging those areas, especially in London and the Southeast. So this is actually him speaking to a popular policy. And when it comes to the continuity, I think we should just bear that in mind. So let's just park that one for a moment. And I think where Johnson did succeed, mission was accomplished, was in damaging trust in politics, even more than had been the case prior to his premiership. And this was partly deliberate. This is the part of his government which I have least sympathy for. He did quite deliberately sort of frame the 2019 contest as one of people versus parliament. So it set up that dynamic. And as I mentioned, he played a part in creating that deadlock, which was actually a deadlock within the Conservative Party rather than parliament as such. It's too early to tell, I think, really. I mean, we can go by polling evidence and so on, but we're not going to see the real, effects of this, excuse me. They're not going to see the real effects of this until we have the next election. And I think there's a sort of a few things that could emerge. Either people reject the Conservative Party and switch to the Labour Party, or because you can do this in the United Kingdom, of course, people will simply not turn out to vote. Right, so there will be a kind of a curse on both your houses type of effect, and we will see a very low turnout at the next election. That may actually, low turnouts tend to benefit the incumbent government, may actually be in the Conservative Party's favour. So they're the kind of three areas that I think Johnson's legacy is most significant. But I'll now move on to what sometimes gets called the selection campaign, the leadership election campaign that had to be triggered when Johnson said that he would step down. Now, perhaps before I get to the analysis of Liz Truss and claims about being the continuity candidate, I'll just say a little bit about the mechanism that goes on here. So I don't know if people were able to follow this, but when there's a leadership spill in the Conservative Party now, any member of Parliament can throw their hat in the ring as long as they've got a certain number of other MPs who will support them. So what you initially see is quite a large field of candidates, and they eventually, you have a series of votes and the least popular candidate gets knocked out until you get two candidates. And at that point, the election is then thrown open. So those votes are happening within the parliamentary party. At that point, the election is thrown open to the Conservative Party grassroots, so the membership as a whole, and they, along with the parliamentarians, vote to choose their particular leader. Now, I think the thing to say here is that the two final runners were the two people you can see on the left of your screen there, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. And perhaps it's important to note that the parliamentarians consistently supported Sunak. He was never in second place. And at no stage did the parliamentarians actually choose Liz Truss to be their favoured candidate. And I think that's something that will become important and actually explain something about the situation that we're seeing in the United Kingdom at the moment. There are some other candidates there, Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat and Penny Mordaunt, and the TV presenter in the middle for one of the contestants. And when the results came in early September, it was not quite the kind of landslide that we thought it might have been for Liz Truss. Okay, so she got 57% of the vote. We perhaps thought it was going to be bigger than that. But I think that the dynamic of that leadership election is important, because here Truss positioned herself as the continuity candidate. Remember, Rishi Sunak said there is a different way of doing things. We ought not to be giving tax cuts now. We need a little bit of financial rectitude to get us over the worst of this. Then we might consider tax cuts down the track. Liz Truss had not been involved or had not been one of the cabinet members to resign to force Johnson's hand. So I think that made her seem, it reminds me of Michael Heseltine, who back in 1990, when Margaret Thatcher was ousted, said the person that wields the knife never becomes the leader. And I think that's happened for Rishi Sunak this time around. So, but what it's done is open up the contest to a Conservative Party which has narrowed quite radically over the last 25 years. So back in 1997, the last time there was a change of government to the Labour Party, the Conservative Party numbered an estimated 3 million members. Okay, so it was something, it had a presence in the high streets of particularly South and East England. You would call it a community organisation. And like a lot of other parties, it has shrunk in the intervening period to where now the House of Commons lists its membership as 180,000. So these, of course, are estimates. The parties don't like to sort of give out, their party membership, particularly when it's declining. But when you compare it to, say, the Labour Party and even the Scottish National Party, from a very much smaller pool of people, has got almost the same amount of members as the Conservative Party. So Liz Truss, I think, was speaking to a narrow group of people. And we know that grassroots members tend to be more radical than parliamentarians. And I think this is because parliamentarians, yes, they have to organise in their groups, but they also have to sit across people who have opposed ideas, and they have to work with them on committees, and all that kind of rubs off. And also the parliamentarians are also constituency members, right? So when they're voted, they don't just have to represent Conservative or Labour constituents. They've got to vote. They've got to represent everyone. So they've got a series of different pressures on them to think a little more expansively. But I think party members are not exposed to those pressures, and they can cleave to pure ideologies, if you like. And one thing we notice, so this is not quite the same, is particularly when parties lose government, they tend to go back to core values. So of course, I'm not saying that the Conservatives have lost government, but they might be sort of in power, but not in not in charge anymore. And so something similar might have happened in this particular election campaign. So the continuities, I think, need to be questioned. So I'm just going to flick now to think about foreign policy, because of course Liz Truss was known to Australia. So she's probably the best known of all those candidates, and that was precisely because she was foreign. She was the foreign and the Secretary for Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and she played a key role in negotiating the UK side of the free trade agreement with Australia, which is still to be ratified and come into force, but it's probably round the corner. And I think it's in foreign affairs where we'll see the most continuity. She's handed over to someone called James Cleverly, but she's very committed to supporting Ukraine. So that source of support for the Ukrainian government is not going to dry up as long as she is Prime Minister, I imagine. Part of that is to sustain the idea of global Britain, and that is coming into shape around this so-called Indo-Pacific tilt that was floated last year. And of course, I haven't written it down, but we should mention AUKUS in that as a sort of a subset of the Indo-Pacific tilt and the kind of defence connections that there are about building frigates for the Royal Australian Navy, and possibly submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, and what she calls the network of liberty, which is, I think, part of this sort of broader Anglosphere idea that English-speaking countries or countries with connections to the United Kingdom are inclined towards democracy and free trade and all those things that we associate with liberal worldview. And she does see the UK and Australia as national partners, natural partners. And so I think that that's where we'll see the continuity. But what was interesting is, of course, what has actually changed since she launched herself as the continuity candidate. As we get into the last few, few days, a week of the leadership election contest, she starts to change her tune, and this is because, this is ostensibly, because she's responding to events, but she's also the idea that she might provide relief for those people who were going to experience this month very high and sudden rises in energy bills. She said that she wasn't in favor of handouts. So she starts sort of channeling this very sort of extreme Thatcherite notion of public good and so on. But she reneges on that. Right, so because the pressure grows and she has to sort of say, well, okay, we're going to reinstate this cap on energy prices. Levelling up, which I mentioned, is one of the key areas where I think that government initiative could win over Labour supporters. Was all, some key infrastructural initiatives under that levelling up umbrella had been shelved under Johnson. In particular, part of a rail link that doesn't go from London to everywhere else, but actually goes across, from Liverpool to Hull, joins up that corridor there and opens up, that had been shelved. But levelling up is being demoted. If you look at who's been appointed, in terms of where the ministerial appointments have gone and so on, levelling up has been shelved. Well, not shelved. Sorry, that's an overstatement. But it's said that levelling up will happen, but in a more conservative way, right? So this is a criticism of Johnson for spending money, basically for Johnson and Sunak to spending money. So we can assume that levelling up will have less money allocated to it. And I think that might have political consequences. And then, of course, the real story that we're dealing with now is of course this tax break for high earners, which went down badly, so that even it's amazing to see even the the Bank of England responding in such a way, and the International Monetary Fund and so on, that these institutions must have moved on from the idea of trickle-down economics, the kind of revived Thatcherism that Truss was deliberately trying to position herself. And she's here with Kwasi Kwarteng, who is, if you like, some of the young Turks of the Conservative Party who 10 years ago authored this or co-authored this book called Britannia Unchained, which is all about freeing up Britain, the kind of neo-Thatcherite attempt to free up the United Kingdom. And so we're now, I think that the whole idea of the tax breaks, especially when it's suggested that actually these might be funded, you know, in some way from the public purse, was giving a very this kind of really burst the red wall bubble, and Conservative MPs in those particular seats have never felt secure. They were crucial in getting Johnson out, and I suspect that they are crucial in putting this particular pressure on Truss and Kwarteng, whose mini budget of the 23rd of September has lost its kind of headline event. And I think, you know, whatever way Truss and Kwarteng try and spin this as a kind of, well, it was just a distraction, so we dropped it. I think that's not true. I think that was core to their vision for growth for the United Kingdom. So into that, of course, is going to cut, we're assuming, I mean, and this is quite the amazing thing that we could explore in the questions, assuming Truss is still in power in several months' time, will come the coronation, right? Because this is a significant moment of both change and continuity. It's change in the monarch, it's change in the monarch, but the crown is continuous. The Queen is dead, long live the King, right? The King's two bodies, as it used to be known. So this is not without political importance, is what I'm trying to say. Now, and of course, oftentimes people will say, well, the crown is above politics, and in some senses, it's above party politics, although there would be a side of politics in Australia who might dispute that if you have memories of 1975. But the reason I wanted to put it in is I'm taking my cue from Walter Bagehot. So Conservatives don't usually like to write down the things that they do. You know, their conservatism is sees itself as kind of non-ideological, and whereas the left of politics tends to write masses and masses of stuff, right? So, but one exception to the rule that's really interesting is Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, which was written in 1867. It came at a time of an expanding franchise, which the Liberal Party was ushering in, and the Conservative Party consolidated. And so I'm saying that this is political because the monarchy is a very crucial part of the British and Australian political system. And it's what Bagehot categorized as the dignified part of the constitution. So the efficient part was all the mechanisms of responsible government, and the dignified part was the Lords and the monarchy itself. Now the Lords, of course, even in Britain, has sort of fallen away, and I don't think people would turn out to see a procession of Lords, but of course the Queen and the Crown still has a lot of traction. So here's the Queen with some of her prime ministers. Because there's no John Major, we can date this to before 1990, and I think Margaret Thatcher's polka dot bow puts it about 1988. I thought it'd be useful because, you know, prime ministers get remembered for some good quotes, to just kind of like contrast some of these famous quotes with the situation now. So Harold Macmillan, first of all, famous for saying, "You've never had it so good." And of course, that is just like opposite world to the way people are feeling in the United Kingdom today, who feel like it hasn't been this bad probably since the 1970s. And Harold Wilson, of course, a week is a long time in politics. We've discussed that one already. And Margaret Thatcher's probably, there's several candidates here, aren't they? But the lady is not for turning is perhaps her most famous one. And that was the kind of thing that Truss was trying to emulate. So I do wonder about the damage that this episode has done to Truss's political self-image. And the Queen, of course, was famous for not really saying anything in public that you might remember. But this quote from 1992 was, I think, the best one, annus horribilis. And 1992 does put me in mind of the last time the Conservatives lost that mantle of economic competence as managers, when the British government was ejected from the exchange rate mechanism, and then we had 5 years of the major government, but they'd lost that, and it gave New Labour a long time to get its house in order and prepare for government. And Jim Callaghan, famous for talking about a sea change in British politics. And so I'm wondering if we're actually witnessing a sea change in British politics now. You notice I haven't got Ted Heath saying anything. I didn't, I couldn't find anything that he'd said. And Alec Douglas Hume is, there are actually two things. First of all, I was thinking, well, he was only in charge for like a year. So what did he say? There are actually two things that he said. And one was that he was with Harold Wilson on the first televised prime ministerial debate that was held in the United Kingdom. And the story goes is that the woman doing his makeup before this was kind of like flicking the brush all around his head, and he's got quite a dome, and she kind of tisked at him because she couldn't get it quite right. And he said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "You've got a head like a skull." And he said, "Doesn't everyone?" She said, "No." And so the second thing that I remember is that actually, and this is just germane to the situation that the Conservative Party might find itself in now, is that in the old days, you didn't have this selection contest, you got sounded out. So the Tory grandees would come and take the pulse of the parliamentary party, and then they'd see if you were ready to, fancied leading. And the story goes that when Alec Douglas Hume was approached, and one of the grandees said, "We think you would be good as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom," he said, "Oh God, not me." And I think that maybe this is something that the Conservative Party, if you've had 3 changes of leadership, you're probably not on your A team. And so they might be running out of a pool of talent there. So I'm just going to say 2 quick things because I'm mindful of the time. I want to get to questions. 2 quick things about the Carolingian succession. I just like calling it that. It sounds medieval. And so of course, there is strong support for monarchy. But it was very interesting. I was actually in India when the news of the Queen's death broke out, and I was sort of literally halfway between the United Kingdom and Australia. And there were some dissonances between the kind of official narrative and what people were saying and thinking here, or not saying and thinking here. And of course, I think that support for the monarchy will go up in a very personal moment, like a funeral. And the way Bagehot says that the monarchy works is the embodiment of the system. You may not understand how responsible government really works, but you might like the monarch. And I think Queen Elizabeth did a good job of that. I do think that a lot of the memory that we heard about her service and her skill at this was actually from the last 20 years. It's a post-Diana phenomenon. We had to remember that the monarchy was not as popular as it is today in the 1990s or even in the 1970s. And that was partly to do with the changing media environment. So that was going on. And there, of course, there are challenges. Succession is the weak link in a hereditary system. This is where it can all go wrong and where contestation comes out. I'm not suggesting that there will be contestation over Charles becoming king, but it has provided an opportunity for places, particularly in the West Indies, but also here, of course, to raise that question again of, well, what is Australia's future relationship with the monarchy? And even in the United Kingdom, I found this interesting. I got this from the British Social Attitudes Survey. There is a kind of a weakening of support. I mean, it's hard to read into some of those, like quite how long lasting that is, but there does seem to be a slight downward trend in weakening of support. So we get this idea that about 60% of the people polled in 2021 thought that the monarchy was a good idea or a very good idea. So first of all, notice that the question is not asked before 1994. It only comes onto the Social Attitudes Survey because it's assumed before then that, it's not even worth asking the question, right? But so after the Annus Horribilis of 1992 finds its way onto this longitudinal survey, and support there is solid at 60%, but it's not overwhelming at 60%. And if I switch to some anecdotal evidence, I didn't get any text from any friends in England during the period of mourning. I got friendly, supportive things from people in America, France, and Italy, all republics, might point out, but nothing from England. And what happens is, for people who are not especially pro-monarchy in England, just retreat into themselves when moments like this happen. I'm basing this on the response to Diana's death as well, is that there's not in the United Kingdom anything like the Australian Republican movement as it was in its prime in the 1990s. But the opinion there isn't sort of like enormously in favour. Last thing to say about this is, round here, is that actually young people identify with the monarchy the least. Now, that could be, well, we could speculate about why that might be. But the thing is we're not quite sure, is that a cohort effect? Will these people remain, unimpressed by the monarchy as they get older? Or do people just get more conservative as they get older? So difficult to draw any conclusions there. But I do think that there are other constitutional changes potentially that Liz Truss would have to deal with, and some of those, even within the next week. So Liz Truss probably will have to deal with those. The first is that on the 9th of October, the Supreme Court will hand down a decision on whether Scotland can constitutionally have an independence referendum that has not been bestowed by the Westminster government, because Boris Johnson was saying he wouldn't allow that. And the Northern Ireland Protocol is being renegotiated with the EU. That started the day before yesterday. And I do think I just make the point that a coronation is more political than a funeral. So if the role of the monarch is to be someone with whom citizens can identify, if you're a certain, above a certain age, a very young age, you've probably been to a funeral and you can have a sense of sympathy. A coronation is not something most people can empathize with. And it's much more political, because even in a constitutional monarchy, that's about an individual assuming influence, right? So I think that might be difficult to, will generate more political discussion than the funeral did. So 2 more slides to go. Here's what I wrote last week. So anyway, I did think that the leadership election meant that there are a lot of MPs who didn't have Truss as their first choice. So bear that in mind when we're thinking about, so there's a bunch of people that we call the dispossessed. So, those ministers who've lost ministerial positions, keep your enemies close kind of philosophy, or the never possessed, the ambitious who have been overlooked in this particular time. And so that's a lot of discontent on the backbenches. But Boris's greatest legacy, which I mentioned at the outset and really can't be overlooked, is a 71-seat majority. Right, it started out as 80. It's been whittled away for by-elections and the speaker and all that kind of stuff. But of course, even that's looking vulnerable. And the question is then why? How could you? I mean, it would be truly amazing if the government lost, in that way. This goes back to the Red Wall. I've mentioned that. There's these Northern and Midland seats that used to vote Labour. Now they voted, or in 2019, they voted Conservative. The question is, will they flip back? Will they not? Will those voters not turn out? Will they simply abstain, or will they flip back? But certainly the MPs there feel very vulnerable. And the Blue Wall, which is something that's come into focus, was those Remain voting Conservatives in the south of England who, kind of went along with Boris Johnson because he wasn't Jeremy Corbyn. But now that the Labour Party has a different leader, which, he's often, Keir Starmer is often sort of criticised as being anodyne, but I think that, that's not a bad strategy. And I think the Labour victory in 2022 here in Australia was something analogous going on. People sort of hadn't really engaged with Anthony Albanese, perhaps. He was sort of seen as not inspiring, but when you've got a government that's on its way out, I think it's actually, you don't necessarily need a Bob Hawke. You need someone who's just going to kind of steer the opposition ship home. And what I'm not clear about is that perhaps now that Johnson has gone, those Conservative voters who in by-elections have been sending a message that they're not happy with the Johnson Conservative Party might return to the fold. They might respond to Liz Truss as a woman, because I don't know, but I suspect a lot of those voters were female voters. But I think that the kind of Thatcherite economics that Truss and Kwarteng have been pushing and now have walked back from would not be popular in those blue wall seats either. So Conservative Party really going all out to lose the next election on the current events. So just to conclude, 4 points then. The Johnson legacy. I think we can be sceptical about his own appraisal and also the way that he's already been seen as someone who got Brexit done. Brexit isn't done, and its effects won't be seen for a while. But he is leaving a very large majority in Parliament for Truss. I think this. I didn't mention the culture wars, but one aspect of keeping this fragile electoral coalition alive in the north is to talk about identity issues, and I suspect we might see a bit more of that as that coalition fragments a little bit. I mean, even if Truss and Kwarteng hadn't scored the own goal that they scored over the last couple of weeks, she was at the helm of already an aging government. So there's just the its time factor could play into this as well. But voter loyalty in the United Kingdom has been vulnerable since at least 2015, in fact, since 2010. And I suspect that the next election won't be will continue that volatility. And the English constitution, the ultimate in continuity, I guess, convention in Parliament under Johnson has taken a beating since 2016 as well. And I do think that the coronation will provide a moment of change. It's the risky moment in the hereditary, the operation of the hereditary principle. And I'm not suggesting that there'll be masses of people who want Britain to become a republic, but I do think that there will be this will be a moment for a reappraisal and a much more political and politicised consideration of the monarchy than we saw during the Queen's period of mourning. Thank you.
Ben, thank you very much. We've got a roving mic which will come around just as we're sending it. Maybe I can just pitch one in from Zoom. What is Rishi Sunak up to at the moment? And should Truss have appointed him to a key cabinet role, or would he have accepted it?
Yeah, Rishi Sunak, well, I think we don't know. He's just not at the conference. So he decided that he would stay away from the conference. And I think we can understand why that would happen, maybe from a personal perspective, and even perhaps from a party management perspective. But I suppose he brings a lot of support with him. So it could perhaps have been wise for Liz Truss to appoint him into the cabinet, a bit like Gillard did with Kevin Rudd back in 2013, or sorry, 2010, beg your pardon. Yeah, look, I mean, I don't, he and his family and friends will know what he's doing, but he's pointedly not at the conference. So, read into that what you will.
Thank you. Zara Kimpton, I'm National Vice President of the AAA. Thinking of the Carolingian era, we've just had an example of what the new monarch can do, and that is, or in fact, it's the PM, I mean, telling the monarch that he's not to go to COP27. Now, I'm interested in how that's going to pan out as far as the relationship between the two. Realizing, of course, that things have changed enormously since COP26, where Boris Johnson was absolutely at his height, and things have changed very much about the whole energy situation in Europe. So there's a lot packed into that question.
Yeah, there's a lot of change in there, isn't there? So I think it's quite interesting that sustainability and environmental issues were actually being championed by King Charles long before they were fashionable. In fact, he used to be kind of laughed at a bit for you know, championing those causes, and now they've come good. And he, I think it was interesting that he said he would uphold the Constitution, which you can, you know, on the one hand you can say, well, yeah, of course the monarch will say that, but given the kind of the sort of push against convention, and the way he spoke out against the Rwanda solution, he's a much more interventionist person than his mum. And you know, I think he has a political mind, in a way that the Queen, well, she did, but operated it differently. I think he's a bit more interventionist. And I think that I just wanted to note that. And I think that in terms of, yes, the energy situation is vastly different now, isn't it? In terms of the pressure that the war in the Ukraine has brought about. So yeah, I think I read Liz Truss telling him not to go as a signal that what she wanted to signal about her views on the environment, which were more sceptical than Johnson's. Yeah.
Derek McDougall, University of Melbourne. I wonder if you could comment further on the on Northern Ireland, the protocol issue, but also the impasse there about forming a government. What's Truss's approach, would you say, with both those issues?
She was very brief, but she very briefly had the Northern Ireland portfolio given to her. I think that you know, one of the elements of continuity that I thought would come out, and maybe it still will here, is that, you know, the goading the EU is still seen as an important kind of vote winner in those northern red wall seats. So if that's the case, then we might expect a tough line from her on that particular issue of the protocol. But again, I sort of note all this kind of the shift that there was about, you know, like Steve Baker, one of the Eurosceptic MPs, was apologising for not taking the EU's legitimate interests into account during negotiations, and I think, you know, and maybe in the kind of like hard edged world of negotiations, that maybe because Truss is seen to sort of go back on the tax cut, people might feel that there's ways of pressuring her on other issues, and that could be one of them, because the EU never abandoned Ireland in all of the Brexit negotiations. I think there was a sense amongst the British government that certain states could be isolated in the early parts of, you know, 2016 and 17, and that never happened. So I think that I can't speak to the formation of the government in Northern Ireland itself, but I think in terms of the actual EU negotiations, we might expect some hard talk.
Thank you. Hazel Bracington, do you have a comment on the implications of your 4 issues you've identified for British soft power in the wider global environment?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yes, the monarchy and soft power, or the Queen and soft power. I suppose, you know, we have to distinguish those 2 elements there. And certainly, you know, this idea of the Queen being the world's queen, which I think is, you know, ought to be challenged, but there's also some truth in it in as well, you know, that I mean, when I was in India, a lot, but not all, but a lot of flags were at half mast. And so it would be interesting. I mean, I don't know that I have a direct answer to your question, but I do think that she projected an image of Britain that was well received in certain quarters, but there was skepticism towards it as well from other quarters. And I think it sort of depends where you went in the former empire and who you spoke to, where that happened. But you know, yes, I think that there was a significant, you know, that is another sort of arm of British politics, that, you know, and even like just getting world leaders together. I mean, I don't know if anything was discussed, but you know, got to do a coronation again soon. So all the Commonwealth leaders at least will have to be back in London. And, you know, you would think with a little longer to organise, there'll be some fringe meetings and stuff will be discussed.
Thanks. Can I just, oh, sorry, Charles Richardson. Can I draw you out a little bit on the question of Ukraine? As you know, in a lot of parties on the right in the West, there's a significant pro-Putin element. We see it particularly in the more Trumpy parts of the Republican Party, but it happens in a lot of countries. At least looking from a distance, we don't seem to see that in the Conservative Party. Is that right? And if so, why would that be?
That's a really interesting question, because it also puts me in mind of the Italian election, because of course Berlusconi and Salvini are quite close to Putin as well. But you're right, we don't see that in the Conservative Party as far as I'm aware. And certainly Truss, even in her speech this morning, the morning before yesterday, when she was defending the tax cuts, had the Ukraine UK lapel badge on. So that's a very important thing for her, is to keep that. And she, of course, has met Medvedev, and that didn't go well. And so, you know, that kind of personal dimension to diplomacy might come into it. But yes, like, well, you know, maybe, you know, for all that people criticised Johnson, or those people who did criticise Johnson, it was never really an Orban or a Trump or a, you know, a Salvini, even a Berlusconi, really. So maybe it's something about like the nature of that emergent and resurgent right wing that really venerates the strong man, doesn't it? And they did sort of have stars in their eyes about Putin. But I'm not aware of you know, possibly Nigel Farage would be, you know, but of course he sits outside of the Conservative Party, although, you know, probably has friends within the Conservative Party. But Alex Salmond, the former head of, he worked for RT. So there's, and of course the Russians did play a part in, you know, the Brexit vote we now know. But yeah, a great question.
David Lamb, member of the Institute. Thank you for a most interesting, fascinating description of chaos. My question is, in Australia, there have been many political party strategists that have been of interest to British people. What do you think are the chances of the independence movement that has been so successful in Australia taking root in the UK?
Yeah, that's also a great question, and I'm quite interested in the sort of the comparison between the federal election here and what that might tell us about politics in Britain. There's never been quite the same tradition of independent MPs. There have been independent MPs. I think they tend to get a bit lost in the larger parliament. So there's 650 seats versus now 151 or 150 in Australia. And so I don't think they've got quite the leverage. So party organisation matters there. But I think there would be, it wouldn't surprise me if there was some similar movement in terms of a rejection of two-party politics. So I think that, well, yes, it is harder for them to get up. So there's that as well. And it's just a question of the other thing about the voting system, you don't have to vote. So, you know, abstentions start to really matter. So the last time that the Conservatives lost government in 1997, partly because 2 million people that voted Conservative beforehand just didn't turn out. So that was how they were registering their dissatisfaction with the Conservative government. It wasn't by sending their vote somewhere else. They just didn't vote. So we might imagine something happening there, But then we've got to start to, I mean, the Labour Party is sort of all on a political high at the moment, and you can tell that because they're not fighting each other and they're all saying how great the leader is and all that sort of stuff that we rarely see. So they must be picking up on something. But, you know, I think then we have to start to think, well, you know, it's not necessarily that someone who voted Conservative in 2019 might then vote Labour, and it's a straight swap. They might not vote. They might vote for the Liberal Democrats. You know, there might be some seats in Scotland where I think the atmosphere will be different because the Conservatives might pick up votes if this is about an independence referendum by proxy or what, you know, like, so we'll start to sort of see a whole different, the Greens are not well represented in Britain either. So I think it is a question of like, you never know. Maybe this is the moment when things will change, but it's not the way things have, the continuity wouldn't suggest that it's likely to happen.
Okay, well, on that note, it brings us neatly to 7 o'clock. Ben, thank you so much for coming back, giving such an entertaining, detailed coverage. It's fascinating what's going on. We will keep watching. Zoom audience, thank you very much for your interest and for joining us. Those in the room, please feel free to stick around and join Ben for a chat, a glass of wine. See you again next time.
Thank you, Zoom.